when people talk about starting a company, there's one thing about doing it because you care about something. And I remember before we started, at that point it was called ZAG, it was actually not named yet. Scott said to me that he worked on a lot of business plan in the previous 6 months, but every time it was an automotive about that thick, and it wasn't, it was about that thick. I think a lot of what we're going to hear today is when you have as big a vision to change as big as industry as the automotive vision, you need to have not only the big idea, but you need to have the ability to see through how the industry could change and what are the change agents within that industry. Scott, from day one, even in the Cars Direct days, had the vision of it's a 100-year-old industry and some fundamentals about it need to change. Through the waves and troughs of that experience, which is probably what we're going to hear about today, right? It's one thing to say that you're going to be an entrepreneur that's going to do it when the good times are there. It's another to know that you're going to do it one company after another company after another company, and you're going to get the task done. And when we got together to start the last one, which is what we're on now, the theme of the founders getting together was job not done yet. Let's go do it. So thank you for
job's still not done.
Thank you for sticking with us all these years, and thank you for coming and sharing your story with us.
Cool. Great. Well, I want to make sure that this is useful for you guys. So first sort of house rules, this should be a conversation. If you guys find something that I say at all intriguing or you want me to go down that rabbit hole, just raise your hand and tell me, explain that more or tell me more about it. And I see a lot of familiar faces, so hopefully this won't be boring. But you know, I talked to Paul and I said, you know, how do you define success? You know, what do you want me to hit? And I guess you guys are all entrepreneurs starting your own companies and sort of going through your own trials and just by way of background, I've incorporated 37 businesses at this point, and I've raised a little over 1.8 billion in venture capital for those companies. And it's almost 110 financings that I've closed at this point. And so in a lot of ways you could say I'm a fundraiser, and that's my core skill set. And something really interesting happened along the way with TrueCar, where I went through a divorce, I went through sort of a change in the things that mattered to me in my life, and I've now got 4 kids, my oldest is 10, and so it all sort of happened at the same time where I decided, you know what, I don't value the velocity and quantity of companies that I'm creating. I'd actually like to go deep, and I'd like this to be my thing. So hopefully in telling you sort of the TrueCar story, and I'll sort of weave in some other related things that I've done along telling that, you guys will get some value out of that. To me, TrueCar is sort of the extension of almost 15 of those 37 companies. I was the founder of a company called carsdirect.com, but I've also had companies that all the way back to my very first one were related to automotive. And so I'm definitely a car guy. I'm a passionate car guy. Along the way, I've met a lot of people who are detractors to what I do, and certainly the way we have gone about it has been disruptive, and it's been provocative, and we go into a very big market. And to give you a sense of how big the market is, the purchase of a car is not just a car. It's also, in 90% of cases, financing or leasing. But the purchase of a car also requires insurance. And the purchase of a car almost always requires maintenance and repair, and certainly refueling and accessories and all the things that come along with vehicle ownership. And ultimately, there's the frustration of selling your car and how do you get out of that vehicle. And so when you look at that market end to end, the sale of new cars is about a $600 to $700 billion a year market. That sounds really great, and it's a big market for sure. But the used car market is almost 3 times as large as the new car market. And when you add all those other related businesses, you get a $4.3 trillion annual ecosystem in the US, which is 22% of GDP. And it's by far the most fucked up. In terms of, it's super inefficient. And if you ask people what is the experience they hate the most in retail, it's almost always buying a car. And there's always the discussion of, whether or not Congress is hated more than car dealers, but that's almost always the analogy, right? And so, in sort of the classic entrepreneurial sense, taking something that you love, my passion for cars and really my passion for solving problems, which I think are part of the entrepreneurial process, and then applying it to a really big market that's really screwed up and very inefficient is very interesting. And at this point, we study that market, right? We wanted to understand, just sort of in numerical terms, what does inefficiency really mean? And so in the car business, if you go back to sort of how that overall industry evolved, you can go back all the way to Henry Ford. And what do you credit Henry Ford with other than mass production, right? And mass production ultimately creates something that is predictable, it is produced with consistency, and ultimately that creates sort of a very fungible experience at the consumer level. You should be able to buy that product at any location from any retailer, and you should be able to have the same experience with it. And certainly, great examples of this are home electronics, computers, home appliances. It doesn't matter where you get your Frigidaire, you believe that that Frigidaire is going to be a certain thing. And that comes from manufacturing predictability. And so the automobile, in many ways, is a commoditized thing, an evolved product, and yet I think you guys all probably just know that buying a car isn't really that easy, right? Buying a car involves negotiation. And so we measured the delta between the person who paid the most and the person who paid the least. And we also put that on an axis over time and said, if there's a presumption, and I put this in the context of we've gotten a lot of pushback for what we do, right? So TrueCar has been a disruptive company and the industry has not liked or appreciated us. And they've tried to kill us and boycott us and not do business with us. And so we've had to go back and sort of look at this issue, and we said, is transparency bad for auto retail? Which is sort of an existential question, because if the entire industry that you have to work with has to accept you at some level, they have to fundamentally, or at least some part of them, buy into that argument. And so the question of is transparency good for retail sort of goes back to the introduction of technology and the digitization of information about the product and whether or not people had access to that information. And so we sort of called 1998 the starting gun. That's when we believe e-commerce really took hold, and there was greater than 5% of consumers going online and shopping for anything, let alone a car. And so the first wave of all of this was just getting product information, and it turns out that that's a really fundamental shift. So 1998, all of the car companies started putting online brochures on the web. And what they started doing is shifting consumer behavior from walking into their local dealership and asking for a brochure and a test drive, which gave the local salesman the opportunity to close the transaction. And they're letting people get content about the car at home in their underwear anonymously. And so you created a situation where there was just no reason to go into the dealership until you were really ready to buy. And I don't think that anybody did it intentionally, but that fundamentally shifted everything. And that really occurred sort of in that 98 timeframe. At that time, you had almost a 30% delta between the high and the low. So let me just put that in real terms. If you're buying a $50,000 car, somebody might be paying just over 40 and somebody might be paying just under 60 for the same exact car. No difference. All normalized in terms of the accessories and the colors and all the choices that go into a car, the identical product, manufactured on the same production line. And that is a huge, huge problem, because when you translate that into dollars based on the average retail selling price of a car in 1998, which was about $27,000, you all of a sudden realize you have a $65 billion measure of inefficiency. But what's fascinating is there is a presumption by the auto industry that when you call them out on that you're saying that everybody's overpaying by $65 billion and we want to go ahead and get that money back. It turns out that when you look at the data, what you find is that half of the people paid too much and the other half of the people paid too little, because there's a lack of discipline at the retail level to hold that price. And so there's this really fascinating thing that we didn't really understand when I got into this, which we've learned, and that is that 15% of all cars are sold at an absolute loss. And you say, economically, why is that rational? Why would anybody do that? And it's because it's not such a theory, but a reality that the transaction doesn't stand alone. Most people don't pay cash for their car, and so financing and how you're going to pay for that car, and 70% of people have to trade in the car that they're currently driving before they can buy another one, how you're going to get rid of that car are all part of that equation. And so there happens to be a whole bunch of terms for it in the car business, but at the end of the day, it just matters on all three of those transactions, is the dealer making enough money in the end to be positive, right? Because dealers make money, let's face it, car dealers still make money. So the reason that they're willing to treat the new car as a loss leader is because they're making a killing in these other areas. And the way that we felt to solve it was to go out and just say, you know what, let's start with what we know we can really report on, which is the transactional price, what everybody paid for the car as a new car, as a commodity, and let's reintroduce trust there. Because in one sense, you can measure that market inefficiency based on a lack of trust, right? Customers just don't trust it either, they don't know when to stop negotiating, and nobody knows what's a fair price. And the only way to actually know a fair price is to find out what everyone else in the room who bought that same car paid over a reasonable period of time in a certain constricted geography. And so that was really the quest, that was the definition of the problem. And it's interesting, if you follow how information and technology and access to information has evolved, the introduction of the smartphone sort of in the 2006-2007 timeframe was sort of the sonic boom that continued to constrict that price distribution. And today we stand on about a 6% price distribution. The average selling price of the car has gone up. That market is still $50 billion inefficient given the size of the market, but it is on a rateable basis much less inefficient than it used to be, and yet we all still have the same perception of the car dealer, in terms of that lack of trust. And so to us, this sort of set up the perfect storm of saying, can we reintroduce trust through transparency? And nobody in the car business had really introduced data as a way of solving this. And so part of all of this was that in 1987, the auto industry really made a big push to digitize automobile information and what was on the car, because they needed to get a lot of manufacturing efficiency. The states quickly caught on to this as a way of shortening the time frame from a sale to collecting the sales tax, right? So instead of having a 20-day float, the states were like, well, we'll just give dot matrix printers to all the dealers, they'll do registration there, and they'll electronically submit and collect tax and submit the tax revenue to us instantly. And so that became a 50-state sort of immediate process. The beautiful thing is that from 1987 on, we have almost perfect transaction data. And when you buy a car, it turns out you leave a data trail a mile wide. And you not only you have the data, which is really powerful, the dealer has the data. There's a whole ecosystem of companies that serve dealers and help them to sort through their management of that data. And then you've got financing, leasing, everybody who's in that ecosystem. You've got insurance, everybody in that ecosystem. Every time you apply for a car loan or a lease or insurance, you have to say what it is they're underwriting or what it is they're insuring. So they want to have all that detail as well. Tax, title, insurance, credit applications, Experian, TransUnion, Equifax. You can get all of this data today. And the problem is that when somebody calls the engine an EcoBoost engine, nobody knows what that means. So the auto industry at a very, very intentional level has decided to make automotive sort of the canonical categorization of what is a car very, very impossible to sort out. You can't really compare the car one to the other. But it's not an impossible task. You've got 50 brands, you've got 500 models roughly, 5,000 trims, and 100 million permutations a year. You can actually contain that in some kind of an analysis that gives you the ability to defract it. And it turns out if you're buying a Porsche 911, given how many Porsche 911s are sold over the course of a year in the US, you are probably buying a totally unique vehicle. And they do that intentionally. It's a very highly configurable car. But if you back out every single option or accessory that you put on that Porsche 911 and it's the turbo trim, then all of a sudden, if we do it in a way that is standard across everybody who's buying that vehicle, we now get a very, very clear view of what is a rational price. And then you can rebuild that car based on your ideal configuration. And it sounds simple. It's just applying math to a really, really rudimentary set of data. And what you get is absolute clarity about what is a fair price. You can take somebody who's never bought a car before and make them an expert in 30 seconds. The problem is, in order to do that, you're sort of the one publishing the magician's secrets, right? And that's a highly unpopular point of view. Our business, the way that we grew it was pretty interesting. We knew that after having founded Cars Direct, that just the challenge of getting 100 million permutations of car up per year so that you could have a web experience that allowed you to robustly go through that in an accurate manner, that was a high enough hurdle. I mean, just to say I want to start that company means that you've got to probably invest at least $10 to $20 million in the creation of the system to be able to pull that off. So we did that, and that was certainly part of the early expense in building the business. From there, you have to say, you know what, if we're going to connect customers with dealers, and dealers are the only ones who can legally sell cars, we have to sort of change the rules with dealers. So we came up with this sort of bargain with them that said, you don't have to pay for leads, you have to pay for sales. And it's a really fascinating thing what happened in sort of the 98, 99 timeframe. Just to give you a sense of how big, again, this market is, but from a different point of view, you've got manufacturers that are spending collectively $16 billion a year on advertising cars. $16 billion a year. And then you've got dealers that are spending another $8 billion on top of that to market cars. So and that doesn't include used cars, that's the new car channel spend. And so these are huge categories. And what ended up happening in sort of the 98, 99 timeframe is most of the dealers were going to market with local cable, radio, and classified advertising. That's where they were spending their budgets when they would go and look for customers. And that is impression-based monetization. They were looking for how many times do I need to get my name out there for my local customers to want to come into my store? And that's a big problem where in markets like Los Angeles, you've got 65 Toyota stores, 240 GM stores, 400 Ford stores, more than you have In-N-Out burgers. I mean, it's crazy how many car dealers there are in these metro areas. There's nearly 40,000 car dealers across the country today. And so you've got just a massive overpopulation of the dealers. And the I just lost my train of thought. Where was I at?
Number of In-N-Outs.
The what?
Number of In-N-Outs.
No, that's not where I was. I'm going down a different path.
$16 billion plus $8.
Yeah, okay, got it. So the car dealers and the manufacturers are spending all this money, but they're spending with traditional media. The internet comes along and says, we're going to give you the ability to buy names, lead gen. And what business owner wouldn't rather buy the name of an in-market customer than somebody who just was an impression, right? So it's a very natural transition. And so the way that lead gen got started was this very sort of almost Faustian agreement that these companies made with customers, which is give me your name, surrender your anonymity, and I'll get you a price. And what they would do is then turn around and sell your name, and that entire value proposition simply amplifies the thing that everybody hated about buying a car. What you hated about buying a car was dealing with the salesman, and now you've got 6 of them pulling you at home, right? And so it doesn't solve the customer's problem at all, but it does definitely disintermediate traditional media. So you saw in that whole ecosystem where you're spending nearly $25 billion, half or more of it shift all the way to the web. This is why everybody was just dying on the newspaper side, and it just wasn't cars, it was everything, right? So that 98, 99 time frame was just a massive transformational change around the addressability of a lead versus the impression-based monetization that was happening before. We're now going through another sonic boom, if you will, where, and this is our whole sort of value proposition as a business. You're not going to have to pay for a lead, you're going to pay for a sale. What business owner wouldn't rather just pay for a sale and remove the variable marketing expense, make it a cog in the business? That makes the business more valuable, right? Why not just pay for sales? And the trick in that is you have to not just be able to track the introduction, you have to be able to track all the way through the business to a sale. So one of the bargains we made is that given that dealers are now digitizing all of this transaction data for manufacturers and for tax purposes, if we can get that same information and analyze it, we can then see when a sale occurs from an introduction that we've made. It changes our entire focus from quantitatively selling names to introducing customers who want to buy cars. And it creates this sort of magical alignment where the experiences tend to evolve towards really getting to that outcome. And there is just a very psychological reality to if you align your interests with your customer, everybody sort of wins. And we started out that way, and I do believe that the cost per sale business is going to come through in all advertising channels. I think in auto, we're really the only company at scale today that offers that to dealers. And so our value proposition is you don't have to pay for leads, you don't have to pay for marketing. But if you sell a car to one of our customers, you pay us $300. Well, $300 represents almost a 50% discount to what they were spending before. So that is a home run for them, and it becomes a cost of goods in their business. So you would think problem solved, nobody's going to be upset about this. It turns out that in 2011, we as a company had gotten to a point where we were able to raise money at almost a $500 million valuation. We had taken in a lot of capital. The company was absolutely rocking and rolling. We were selling nearly 30,000 vehicles a month through our program to our network of nearly 6,000 dealers. If any of you have been in a startup that has gone through that arc and gone through we're now profitable and we're likely to go public or get acquired phase, there's nothing more euphoric than that. It's a lot of fun. And it was even more fun because at that point in time we were also profitable for a little over a year and a half. And for me, and this is probably not a great fact, but of the 37 businesses that I've incorporated, there's only 2 that have been operated profitably, and only 1 by me, and that's this one, right? So TrueCar, to have it run profitably really made the folks who said, yeah, you're a great fundraiser, say, wow, you're probably a good operator too. And that was sort of this new life for me, right? Where people weren't just calling me a promoter, they were actually thinking I'm an operator. Literally like a record screeching to a halt. We encountered so much industry resistance, and we didn't really see it coming. We went on television in a very big way. So we went on TV in November of 2011 at a pace of $7 million a month nationally, which that's $100 million a year brand campaign. I mean, that is, we're here and we want you to notice us, and everybody noticed us. And what we observed, and this is now with 2020 hindsight because we've looked at all the data, in key markets like Alexandria, Virginia, the price distribution on a Nissan Altima went from 13% to 3%. Because everybody was walking in with a straw man offer from TrueCar saying, sell it to me for this price or I'm going to go online and buy it from then. And what's fascinating is you would think that dealers would say, oh no, that's a loss. I'm losing money if I sell the car at that price. Nope, they blow right through that. They do not care at the retail level. They have no visibility anymore into what the cost structure of a car is. And in fact, there are 13 to 15 layers of profitability that the salesman selling you the car does not know the owner of the dealership is getting back from the manufacturer. And the reason for that is, if they knew, they'd give it away. Salesmen always give it away, right? So what they did is have you guys ever heard of, or have you ever had the experience, you go into a car dealer and they say, look, I really need you to fill out the survey, right, and give me a good score? In the car business, that's called the CSI score, the Customer Satisfaction Index. They want a good score because the manufacturers have said, if you are above a certain threshold in terms of your CSI rating, we'll give you a bonus on every car you sold of an additional $400. Trust me, anything they can do to rig that number to make sure they clear that bar, they're going to do, right? And there are all sorts of similar types of incentives that have really been done to protect margin at the dealership level. And what's fascinating is you guys have all heard of MSRP, right? Manufacturer's suggested retail price. It really is the Monroney sticker. That's really where it originally came from. And the MSRP on the car is just what it sounds like. It's the suggestion that you pay this amount. It's not really what people ultimately pay. And about 23 years ago, they came up with a theory that people don't believe the MSRP anymore. So we're going to go ahead, and the manufacturers, and I believe, we're being recorded, so I don't know, but I think there was definitely, a lot of people communicating at the OEM level said, hey, why don't we publish invoice? So they published this number, and what does invoice mean? Well, invoice to most humans that speak English means cost, right? You would think it's like the carbon in the invoice, the tissue, the bill of lading. I mean, this is the etymology of this word, and yet in auto it doesn't mean cost at all. It has nothing to do with cost. It's just simply a bullshit word that we all mistake for cost. And it was intentionally done. and people think, oh, well, that's the cost, and that's not really the cost. So now what do we do, right? And what's fascinating is if you look back at sort of how we've all come to believe prices are fair or not, how many have heard of Kelley Blue Book? Okay, so here's a great story. 85-year-old company. You guys know how it got started? There's a car dealer in Southern California. His name was Les Kelly. I'm not kidding. He was sick of people calling him saying, what would you pay for that car? He said, stop calling me. I'm going to print it in a book and you can pay for my advice. And that's the origin of the Kelley Blue Book. Because he was such a smart guy that his advice is what drove everyone else to set their prices. So that other car dealers would then say, well, Les Kelly would give you $1,200 for that Duesenberg, so I'll go ahead and give you $1,200 for that Duesenberg. And that became the market price. What Les Kelly is a market maker. And that's true of any market. It doesn't matter whether it's auto or NASDAQ. Market makers have a role. The challenge is that when markets become fully liquid and they become fully transparent, you don't need a market maker anymore, you need transparent data. Because data actually tells the tale. So one of the things that sort of correlates to this whole story is the death of guidebooks in the auto space. This whole notion that Kelley Blue Book is a trusted resource is actually crap. And I hope this gets on the web. It is absolutely crap. It is their personal opinion. What happened when Les Kelly died is car dealers would get together on the phone and they formed a council and they would say, what should we sell that for? And they would all agree and then they would publish that number. It's called collusion, right? And that is exactly how that company got all the way to the doorstep of the internet and they said, okay, now we're gonna go ahead and publish it. So it's an astonishing reality that most consumers do consider that to be a valid resource when in fact it's 13% too high. $10 billion of the overpayment that's going on in the auto space is because we all believe Kelley is the right number. Fascinating. So this has all the makings of like this epic tale where we're gonna, our competitors are,
Just briefly.
yeah.
Do you want to say like no tweeting and anything or?
I don't care.
You don't care?
Yeah, I don't care. You can tweet if you want. I mean, honestly, what's interesting is we're finally at a point as a company where I think we should be mad as hell about what Kelley is doing and what Edmunds is doing and what these other companies are doing because they don't have the discipline around the data and we do at this point. And this last year, we went through a boycott. I mean, when we hit that point of relevance where we started advertising at that level and so many dealers were responding, they literally ran right off the cliff. And my defense to that at the time was, that's not economically rational. I mean, ultimately, if you sell a car at a loss, you will go out of business. So chaos theory would dictate, once you do, the market will then find equilibrium and you'll have a sustainable market clearing price where supply and demand meet and everything will be fine. Well, the problem is you had these other, extraneous factors that led to bad decisions and to non-predictable behavior. And what ended up happening is all the dealers that were on the TrueCar system, and we had about a third of all dealers at this time at the end of 2011, on our program, paying us when they sold cars to people that we introduced them to, they were all losing money. Factually speaking, we literally optimized the market to the point they were losing money, and we had no idea because we didn't know where the bottom was. We didn't know what the true cost structure is, and in fact, the unfortunate part is you can't know. The cost structure for Longo Toyota is different than the cost structure for Santa Monica Toyota. The cost structure for a car dealership on 11th Avenue in New York is fundamentally different than one out in Massapequa, right? So you've got just a fundamental issue around everybody has a different bar at which they begin to lose money. And there was this natural selection. The 30% of dealers that were on the TrueCar system happened to be the most price competitive. TrueCar sort of implies a certain price sensitivity and discernment around price, where we already had great prices. It turns out that our prices were better than the other dealers just because the dealers we chose. It had nothing to do with whether TrueCar was working or not. So just the natural state of the dealers on our program meant that they were going to sell cars at a lesser price, and it gave us the ability to say, look, if you buy a car at TrueCar, 3 out of 4 people are paying more than you. Factually true. Had nothing to do with whether or not the market dynamic of TrueCar was really working. And So what happened when we started advertising and we became relevant is those dealers who were already the most competitive dealers started competing with each other and chasing each other right over the cliff. But also other dealers who weren't even on our program were now starting to compete with them, and the whole market averages started coming down. And it was, I think in retrospect, I was very unwilling to allow anybody to say this, but it was a race to the bottom. And it went right below the bottom. And we began to measure how much we were saving consumers, but we were also now beginning to get some idea of how much we were costing dealers. And that became an untenable relationship with those who pay you, right? If the dealers who are paying us are going out of business, you really can't sort of, win the argument with them about chaos theory if they're the ones that have to die to make it, right? To make it work. And so we had to really understand that, and I think we've gone through at this point what most, there's two really interesting narratives. One is we've had to do what marketplaces have to do when they grow up, right? We had a certain amount of liquidity and a certain amount of interest and a certain amount of brand equity where we had to put guardrails on that system. So today, for example, we do proxy a number around how much is a car dealer's cost for our own purposes. Because if a car dealer lists a car at what we know to be a loss, we want to say, why are you doing that? Now, if a car dealer at that moment wants to give us a VIN number and say, because it's the pink one and it's been on my lot for 10 months and I want to blow it out, great. That's rational. But if it's all 40 of your Priuses, that's not rational, and you're going to definitely screw them on the other parts of the transaction, so we're not going to let you do that. And there are 20 things like that we had to do to really grow up the system. At the end of the day, what we were not giving the dealers up until sort of the middle of this last year was any sense of what we were giving the customer. We were giving the customer all the information about what everyone else paid, and sure enough, the dealer could go onto our site and they could pretend to be a customer and they could get that same information. They don't, 99% of the time. But we gave them an easy button on the website that says, would you like to beat the price? And then we even had the brilliance to automate that at one point. So we had effectively a reverse auction button where all the dealers were automating their bids to be lower than the other dealers. It was awesome. And once we realized this, it was a dilemma for the company, because we went through a boycott where 5,700 dealers on the program paying us on average $5,000 to $10,000 a month went to 3,000 dealers in 60 days. 15 million in monthly revenue went to 7 million in monthly revenue in 60 days. The cost structure stayed at 15, but the revenue went down. And so this is usually the moment that they fire the founder, right? And they bring in real management, and that was definitely a discussion topic. And it was interesting how the venom for all of this came out. It was very personal. So I was vilified on the web. I was given horns. I was, given a Karl Marx beard. I mean, the whole thing was just very, very personally tied to my crusade, given how much money I've raised to do this. And we then got a hold of the FTC, had great private meetings, and they said, this is antitrust. It's clear that the dealers are colluding, that they're, through their dealer associations, having semi-weekly phone calls, and they're talking about how to kill you and how to drop the service and . We'll get them. It will take 4 years and $100 million. So that was not an option. And we're running out of money fast now, right? So now we're losing all of a sudden $6-7 million a month. I think our peak was $9 million a month in losses, and very quickly burning through our cash. And we had a crisis in every sense. And so at the same time, I started getting anxiety at night, probably related to this. I've got 300 families that depend on us as an employer, and I cared very deeply about that dimension of the business. And so the pressure was mounting, and then we started getting sort of evidence that some of these dealers were tracking how my kids got to school. And it got very serious very fast. And so, we dominated automotive news, which is the industry trade publication. It's published on a weekly basis. By the time the first 6 months of the year had gone by, we were 42% of the cover stories. I mean, that's massive. We went through just a period where we became the hot topic, and everybody knew who we were. And in a really weird way, and I've been asked now at some of these dealer association conferences where I'm now the keynote speaker, by the way, do you believe that all press is good press? And I do. I do. My investors don't agree yet, and I think that board relations trail reality by about 6 months. So I think in 6 months they'll be as happy as they should be right now. I still think they're smarting from where we were 6 months ago, but we lost $74 million in 2012. I'm still the CEO. I don't know. That's a lot of money to lose and still be the CEO. So I do very much appreciate the confidence they put into me, but I felt like I was the one who was responsible for it, and I needed to turn it around. And there's a narrative that when you are so vilified and such an object of people wanting to tear you down, that it was the look into the abyss moment. And I've had plenty of companies that have either run out of money, or you've gotten to a point where you find a fatal flaw and you have to have that introspective moment. And as an entrepreneur, I can say, I have always believed that if you're a visionary, that's defined as seeing something that others don't, and that there is a never say die-ness to what you do. I would say that, as I've gotten further along, at one point I started an incubator, and one of the disciplines that we had to put into the incubator was to kill great ideas that didn't look like they would make it for a lot of really valid reasons, right? And that has been a really valuable thing to know. It's impossible to tell that to an entrepreneur. Like, you should give up. This is this is part of your learning curve. Chalk it up, move on to the next idea. And for me, that's clearly not what I've done. I've had 15 automotive related startups that are effectively the same thing that we're doing at TrueCar. They all are part of the same argument. Everything that we do today is based on everything I learned in all of those companies, and the hope is that I will get it right. And
By the way, one lesson I think we should take away from this is that it's cool to lose 74 million.
it's so not cool. When I say anxiety, like, I would get home and I couldn't breathe, and so I ended up going to the doctor, and I found out I had a heart murmur, and that freaks you out even more, because as somebody who's never had a health problem, to all of a sudden you have health, you have certain death on the business side, you have your reputation getting completely crushed in the industry. My wife had a baby December 21st, 2011, and I was on the road 90 of the next 100 days. And so there's therapy, and there's all the things that come with that, and this was my second marriage, and so just a whole bunch of really, really challenging things. And I would say that if you look at, and my heart doctor actually said this to me, he said, most of my patients are alphas, ascenders, people who are just accomplishing stuff in life, and that's his practice. And he said, I always know that when they're fighting, he sort of looks at life as like a forefront battle, right? Your personal health, your love and your relationships, your professional life, and your personal finances. And it's like, so those are the four fronts. And he's like, if one of my alphas, my patients, is having a one-front war, I never see them. They're just, and he says they're usually probably not ascending anymore. He says ascenders are always fighting two front wars. They're fighting, two of those major dimensions of their life, and they're doing it all in, right? Like, they're going to either make it or die. And he says it's when they go to 3 that they come into me. And he's like, you have 8.
Yeah.
All right. And he's like, you're fucked. And he's like, you have got to land some of these airplanes in your mind. And because I was not sleeping, part of my health problem was I've been a chronic 3-hour-a-night sleeper because I just can't turn off my brain, and I wasn't working out, and I was getting heavier, and I was 225, and I had been 225 for almost 20 years. And for me, I just was hard charging, and he said it's going to kill you. You got to lose 50 pounds. You got to change the way you live. You got to sleep 6-7 hours a night minimum, and you got to change the way you eat. You got to figure out how you're going to pay your bills. And I'm just like, holy shit. And I literally had a moment where I also realized that up until that time, about 70% of my time had been spent on TrueCar exclusively, and about 30% of my time had been spent on all my other boards that I had turned over to CEOs, but I was on the boards because I founded these companies. and I was making current cash of $500,000 doing these other things, so I could sort of afford to lose a little bit of money at TrueCar and take sort of a techie wage, but I had a lifestyle. I had a boat to float, and I had an ex-wife and payments and all this stuff, and so I literally stopped doing those other things, and my cash flow went back down to an internet CEO's cash flow, right? And I was like, holy shit, like now I've got to start flipping over cars, and I'm selling stuff, and I'm getting out of other things in sort of not the right way. So I'm spending now 20% of my time liquidating shit to keep ahead of the bills, right? And I started looking for houses in Ojai and ways to just cut my cost structure way back. And that's an awful thing too. I mean, there's just so many things about how it really is just this very, very fine balance of keeping these things all working that makes that life work, right? And now I've got 4 kids, and I just, none of it was good. I literally went to one of my board members and I said, I think it's time. Like, I think I should step aside, and I think as a major shareholder in the company that I want to see it succeed. I don't want to fail. Let's conduct a search for CEO. And they said, great, who the fuck is going to do what you've been doing? Like, I literally willed it into existence, and it's a very complex business, and nobody actually believed me, right? So, I mean, back to the vision thing, being a visionary, I still hadn't convinced everybody that what I was saying was actually the truth. It just happened to be that it turned out to have enough momentum and enough cash flow that they were like, let's just see where he goes with this, right? And so in the midst of that, I took sort of a week off, and I just said, I'm going to change my life, and I'm going to scale way back, and I'm just going to start over, and I'm just going to pack it in.
In 1 week.
It was a week, yeah, pack it in all in 1 week, right? And I ended up getting mad towards the end of the week, thinking, how am I going to live this way? And I need to have a view, and like all the things that I thought I needed, right? And I'm like, I won't be able to drive my Aston Martin, and oh shit. And so it turns out those are really motivating things. If you are at a point in your life where you get comfortable with that stuff, to think that you're not going to have it really sucks. And then I realized, you know what? I've got to prioritize my family. How do I make sure they're happy? And I really thought that I could like open up a school and just be their teacher, right? And do homeschooling, and just, I figured how much money I'd have to put aside. It was bad. It was really, really bad. And talk about the abyss though. I mean, it is looking into the abyss. And I've got a couple of friends who have been through some really interesting stuff, and that are mentors to me. And I started polling them, like, hey, have you ever been here? And it turns out they all had, right? They're like, oh, I've been 3 divorces, and like, I was over leveraged. I owed hundreds of millions. It's like, Jesus. And what I realized is all these people are scar tissue. They have so much scar tissue that they actually just become really much better at what they do, and they just get very disciplined and very hard, and they become very rigid in a way that you don't want to be as a young entrepreneur. You want to be really creative and flexible, and and I had never sued anybody in my life except for my ex-wife. And so I had a bygones kind of approach to everything, and I had, I've always had the ability to work with people that sort of, violated my friendship or my trust, and I could sort of see the good in them. And so I sort of came out of that period, and I said, I've got to literally reinvent who I am. I've got to re-look at who I am. And I said, I've got to lose weight. I've got to get my health right. I've got to start eating the right food. I've got to make sure that I drive my kids to school. I've got to have enough time at home. I've got to stop traveling. I've got to make sure our customers know who we are. I've got to control our message. The list was hundreds of things long. And I'm very much a cognitive psychology guy. I totally believe that you can change your outcome by changing your beliefs and changing your decisions. And so I went through the whole thing of just sort of re-architecting my life, and I laid it out, and I was like, wow, that's going to really suck. That's a really hard challenge. Yeah, I'm going to totally do that. And that was it. And that literally was the day we had a company meeting. We just said, that's it. We're calling the bottom. It was like George Bush and mission accomplished, right? We're done. The bad news is over. We're done, and we're going up from here. And I came up with, I thought at the time, really good defensible theories that dealers are very self-interested. And the reason we didn't go below 3,000 dealers is because the boycott wasn't a federation of dealers that all believed in the same thing. The 3,000 that stayed were the parasites who said, if everyone else is leaving, maybe if I stay, I can soak up all that extra stuff. And if this company goes out of business, maybe I don't even have to pay my bills. So we got hard about collections, we got hard about everything that we did, and I went out on the road, and it was a contrition tour. And I would say for my entire career, I have been this ass-kicking, hard-charging, take no prisoners, you know, we're right, you're wrong kind of guy. And it was literally walking in and eating a shit sandwich every single day, 10 times a day, all over the country. And they loved it. I mean, you cannot imagine how gratifying they must have felt to tear me down. And I just said, look, here's the thing. We don't want to be outside of the law. We're not trying to do that. We believe that transparency is good for automotive. The proof is we've got to show you how you can make money. New buyers are going to buy cars a different way. And enough with the punching bag stuff. I mean, I've raised over $1 billion and invested it back into this industry. Not one of you can say you've done more. And so I'm not a parasite. I'm actually just different. And we're where car buying is going. And let us teach you what we know. Instead of us trying to fight you, what if you could hire me? What if I could work for you? And what if our mission, instead of telling customers how to save money, what if our mission, from your point of view, was how you can retain margin and sell more cars and cut costs and get more velocity and beat your competition, your real competition? And that started to resonate. We took a very, I think, strategic approach to understanding who to go to and where, and it did take really convincing everybody over time by repeatedly saying it. It's almost like, you know, the Jack Handy moment. You know, darn it, I'm a good person and people like me, and you have to just keep saying that and saying that. And it took 3 or 4 months before we started getting positive response and good reviews. And I had to go back to my shareholders and raise more money. And that was a very, very tough experience. And it was really a gut check. Are you going to put a dime behind your dollar to see this through, right? I need 50 million more. So if you're not, tell me now and then I'll go raise money from somebody else and we'll do a washout round. But put up or shut up. And it was a gut check for everybody, and everybody ponied and everybody played. And the company has now been on 10 straight months of double-digit growth per month. Since January, we got back to profitability in January. We took a $15 million cost structure January of 2012. It sat at 7 in January of 2013. So we did our own turnaround. We made a list of everybody who worked for us. We made a list of every consultant we had, every vendor we had, and we went out and we recut every single deal. We did not pay one bill. So nobody took a haircut. It wasn't a reorganization. It was a turnaround, pure and simple. And we went from 317 employees down to 280 at our lowest. So we didn't gut the business, and we're now back up to about 300. We cleared back to profitability in January, and we had our best quarter ever in the first quarter of this year. 20% EBITDA showed up, which is great. Yeah, and we're cranking along at about a $130 million run rate right now. And last year, believe it or not, even though we lost $74 million, we grew 23%, which is better than everybody else in our space. So, you know, I think for a company that was going through that stage, if you look at it from the banker's point of view, growth is the most important metric, right? I mean, there's two types of businesses. You can look at a business and say, how much money's in the bank, or how much money are they putting in the bank every day? And that's one way to look at a business. Another way to look at the business is how big is the market and what's their potential and how are they on that arc and what is their ability to dominate or disrupt that market. And there was no doubt we disrupted the market. The all press is good press turned out to be the best thing ever for us. Everyone knows who we are at every level, at every OEM, all the way through. And somebody had said that they met me at the World Economic Forum event. So I've now been to Davos a couple of times. I spoke to the board of automotive governors. It's all the CEOs of all the car companies, and all they wanted to talk about is what will tomorrow's buyers do? How big is the disruption? How should we relate to customers? And this is not an if at this point. We are changing automotive. That price distribution curve has come down, and we believe that we've saved customers in the last year about $20 billion. And that's not just through our business. It's measured in terms of its impact to the overall transparency of the automotive category, and the fact that people are now more informed means they don't overpay. What's also interesting is Kelley Blue Book's numbers have become more real. because they are chasing, they have to, right? When you publish reality, it becomes a baseline that makes you not reality. There's no agenda at TrueCar other than publishing what others are paying. And so for us to say, this is what everyone's paying, the data's here, it showed up, it's amazing, nobody's ever had it before, makes everybody at some point stand up and say, well, are they a liar? Well, yeah, they are.
Yeah.
It's what it comes down to. And so my belief is that those businesses aren't gonna drive and go away. The people who are running them are gonna get smarter, and what they'll do is they'll end up getting transaction data, and they will end up finding the real number. And at that point, once the real number's out there and everybody's publishing the real number, guess what? Nobody can overcharge for a car, but also nobody will have to underpay for a car if you're speaking about that from the dealer point of view. The value of a car will be clear and obvious to everyone on both sides of that equation. Turns out when somebody is informed, they buy more often, they buy more quickly, and they're more satisfied. I mean, this is like the trifecta of consumer happiness, right? And so the dealers that work with us when we make an introduction, they sell a car 1 out of every 3 introductions. Lead gen is 1 out of 25 or 1 out of 30. So in terms of effectiveness for the dealer, it is a huge way for them to save on the cost. And we believed in all that stuff, but it takes the sort of momentum of the business and all of these multifaceted dimensions, and it really comes together with you as an entrepreneur. I mean, at the end of the day, there is a definite different way that our story could have gone. You could have fired me and you could have hired a professional manager, and whether or not that individual who has no necessary credibility with the entire industry, even if it's bad, by the way, the industry didn't say I didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't say I hadn't been in the fight. They just said, we hate you.
Did anybody refuse to meet with you?
There are still some that refuse to meet with me, and in fact, it's interesting. I was just in Detroit last week. So I've been in the auto business now for 23, 24 years. And I did not meet Keith Crane, the guy who publishes automotive news, until February of last year. And when I met him, he said, how is it that you haven't come to meet me in all of this time and doing Cars Direct? And I said, honestly, I didn't care about you. I cared about the consumer, and that's what we were building products and services for. And so Detroit's a shitty airport, and now it's better, but I just don't want to come. Why would I want to meet you? And I said, now I want to meet you. And he slaughtered me, right?
How could he hate you when you're
saying right up in his face, right? And I said, and he's like, well, why do you hate salespeople? And I'm like, the answer was the right answer, which is, that was a mistake to say that I hate salespeople. But if you looked over the arc of my business building in auto, I've had an Economist story, a USA Today story, and a Wall Street Journal story that were all titled The Death of the Salesman. I mean, so that was definitely my rant, that we all hate buying cars. It was something that investors understood, and it was a very, very feared transaction at the retail level. And so everybody said, well, you going in and fixing it represents a lot of opportunity, right? So the 3 vectors that matter about our business in the end, it turns out, to bankers and everyone else, are, how much of the market share do you have today, and how big is that market? How much can you generate in revenue per customer? And given that we are the only transactional business, meaning we're the only sort of marketing channel that makes money when somebody buys a car.
And we have a very good patent on that.
Yeah. How much can you generate in revenue per customer? Because the impression-based monetization businesses that are out there, whether it's Kelly or Edmunds, they've all plateaued. I mean, even my old company, Cars Direct, is a lead gen player, and those businesses are very, very lucrative, but they don't grow because they're monetizing 95% of car shoppers at the most they can get, and they're doing 30 cents per unique visitor. We're doing $8 per unique visitor to the website. That's astonishing, right? And the third one is there's a really interesting sort of exponential velocity issue with the market. People buy cars every 4.5 years. If you can increase the velocity with which they buy cars from 4.5 to 4.4, you take a $4.3 trillion ecosystem and make it a $5 trillion ecosystem. I mean, follow that math. It's awesome.
For everybody.
For everybody. For everybody. You're growing the economy. The ability to say that you're going to solve the biggest problems in the car ownership process, start with helping you get rid of the car that you're currently driving. So why not recognize that dealers are the ones who buy the majority of cars in this country that ultimately have to get resold? Why not use data and information to reveal to the dealer the cars before they're coming into market by allowing the dealer to see what's in the garage and make bids on those cars, because that's what's going to sell at their dealership numerically, through pattern recognition, through just evidence-based decision making, not the ninja art of car pricing and the guy who made the dealership profitable for all those years, right? So the science of pricing is truly transforming that. We believe that we can increase that velocity. So today we've got 1.3% market share. Sounds really lame. 1.3% market share, and AutoNation has 1.3% market share. They're the largest auto retailer in the world. That's a highly fragmented market. Nobody has more than that. Cash for clunkers, you guys remember that? That nearly doubled demand in the marketplace for a new car in a 30-day period. In August of 2009, the number of customers who bought cars nearly doubled in that 1 month because of that program, a stimulus program. We sold nearly twice as many cars. We didn't add one employee to do it. That's scalable. That's awesome, right? Mm-hmm. So the ability for us to say, you know what, Kelley Blue Book can tell you that they've got 95% market share. We've got 1.3% market share. Which business would you rather invest in if you know both, right? Today we monetize at $300 a transaction. We're literally the only one who's navigated that. And it's really interesting, when all of these state dealer associations started to put pressure on us, what they did is they called their local regulators and said, we think they're breaking the law. Investigate them. So we had about a dozen states, big states, but about a dozen states reach out and say, we think you're breaking the law, what say you? There's two ways you can respond to that. One is you can decide, you know what, your laws are obsolete or they're antiquated, and so you need to change them, and so you fight for legislative change, right? And I can tell you that the legislative change should apply to an antiquated law. I'll give you a good example. There is a law in 17 states right now that says you cannot advertise a car for sale in smaller than 12-point font. You know why? Because car dealers were advertising in 4-point font in the classifieds, and you couldn't read it, so when you would come in, they would bait and switch you, right? And so there was a consumer protection rationale behind putting that law in place. Well, that's an obsolete law. In a world of infinite resolution, it's not about a 12-point font. The spirit of the law is, can you read it? And on our sites, you could read everything. And so we were being claimed, it was claimed that we were not compliant on the 12-point font rule. Well, that's a pretty easy thing to comply with. So why would we want to necessarily change that law? You should go in and say, that's a stupid law. But it turns out if you did that, you snowplow the entire solution for every other competitor who wants to come into the space, because they go, wow, 12-point font law is done. Well, there's 25 or 30 of those laws, right?
Why wouldn't you guys just use a 12-point font?
Yeah, so we do now. And we do all of the things that the regulators said we should do, and we've done it wherever possible in all states, right? But there are some things that turned out to be sort of violating a religious belief for us. So one of the things that we don't want to be is a broker. A broker as a business gets valued differently, has different gross margins, has different net margins, has a different COG than we do. And so the problem with being a broker is that it's also very different in all states, right? So California actually has a pro-brokering law, but you got to be a broker. But the disclosures that come with the broker's agreement are so gnarly that nobody would really want to be a broker. So the dealers really won in California. They realized they couldn't get an anti-brokering law, so they got a pro-brokering law with teeth, right? Go all the way over to Virginia, and it says if you're involved in the sale of a car, you're a broker. Well, that would make the newspapers a broker. And they, in Virginia, held us back and told us we could not charge our dealers and that we were out of business because we were violating this low footfall, very subjective, very broadly defined law that we were involved in the sale. And that was their opinion, and it was a panel of 12 dealers. I made that. A kangaroo court. Totally true. And it cost us millions of dollars because we couldn't build dealers, and we made the decision that we're going to just keep operating and give it away. So as long as we aren't charging anybody for it, we can do it, right? So we did that, and then Washington State comes along and says, you know what? We'll give you a broker's license. Just put up a bond. It's really simple. Well, the problem is, if you then accept the offer to take the bond, and become a broker in Washington, then Virginia can now say, I knew you were a broker, right? Well, according to the SEC, a broker is somebody who sets the price, negotiates the price, arbitrages the transaction from car A to car B, delivers the vehicle other than at the dealership, disintermediation, which is the heart of why brokering is bad to dealers, right? They get separated from their customer. You complete the tax, title, the registration on the car, you deliver the vehicle to the customer, and you, most importantly, control the flow of money. We do none of those things, so we're like, we're not a broker. So we had to take the religious view and then fight those fights. We have now responded to all of the regulators in all of those states, and they have said, you're blessed, you're sanctified, whatever. You're compliant, nobody's broken the law, we never had one fine. We turned all the dials on the business down to comply and get through that. And we can now say to the industry, we're legal everywhere. But nobody can say, I know exactly how they did that. Because we didn't legislate the change, we just simply sat down and said, what do we have to do here, and then here, and then here? And then we use that as a way of raising the water table across the board, and so we've, wherever possible, adopted 12-point font in every state, right? And that has turned out to be, for us, intellectual property. It has, how many of you know eBay Motors, right? 12 years ago, eBay Motors made the decision that they would not try to fight the legal and regulatory compliance issues because they have an arbitrage business model and they didn't want to go through what we've just gone through as a company. So they developed a classified billing model for eBay Motors. It is the only two verticals, new and used cars, that they don't have the arbitrage model of an auction. And yet they're still at $70 billion in market cap, right? I mean, it's just amazing what they built, and they don't have the two largest verticals in the US economy under their belt. So they monetize just like everybody else at sort of that 30 to 40 cents per unique visitor level. They've got more traffic than anybody in the market. They should totally be doing what we're doing. So if you look at where we've gotten to as a result of all of this, it's not as though being Google or being eBay or being Amazon or Yahoo or Facebook, it doesn't mean they get to go and just get a speed pass to this, and it doesn't mean that they can just go spend $100 million and figure it out. So we happen to be this unique, super fine thing that's navigated all this stuff, and it has everything to do with the narrative of how nearly close we came to dying. I mean, because the more real that became and the more public that was, the more scary it becomes to everyone else, right? They're like, I don't want to touch that rail, right? And so nobody's doing it. So today we're a good candidate for potentially an acquisition. We'll probably, just given the size and the value of the business at this point, probably go public at some point. It picks up speed from here. The ability to say that the company can double in size every year just on the first metric, market share, for the next 5 is an easy argument. The ability to say through additional products that provide transparency, like True Loan, True Lease, True Quote, True Trade, right? We can bring that same level of education to consumers that are buying all those things. We can get revenue per customer tripled. And there's a whole nother exciting conversation about how you pick up velocity and you can actually shorten the time that people have their car, and so that you can give them a frictionless experience where you can just say, get out of your car and get another one. We'll just bring it in and we'll just handle everything. Here's how you can shop for that car without any friction. I think that's probably more where our mission is in terms of solving that. Those 3 things are so big that, I mean, this isn't in my view, a $1 or $2 billion company. It's a $10 or $20 billion company. It's a major shift in how people buy cars.
So you're saying that you're not, are you concerned that something like Google would come into your space and try to copy what you're doing?
I'm not worried about Google coming into our space and copying what we're doing. I think that would start with a very terrifying reality, right? Google is coming after you. They would have the same problem that we have, and they would have to ultimately come to the same conclusion that they would have to solve it the same way, and then that's a time and investment and resource issue. Why wouldn't Google try to just buy us, right? So I think in the buy or build side of that equation, buy is much, much easier for them given the size of their market and the customer base that they already have. But Google actually is not interested in solving the problem at that kind of a deep, deep level. Google is interested in monetizing at the local level impression-based search, right, and lead gen. So Google has to always be careful about, there's 2 sides of the equation. there is the buy side, who's gonna bid on, clicks if you put everybody in that ecosystem out of business. That's a really big problem. And what makes that entire ecosystem work is a robust secondary market of buyers that are willing to do that. In the auto lead space, you've got retail buyers, which are car dealers, and that's really the end of the line. From there, you've got the aggregators who buy leads from hundreds of sites that then turn around and they arb that lead and sell it. The cost of acquiring a new lead online today already exceeds the value of the lead to those aggregators, and it's starting to already show that the value of a lead to a dealer is been depressed so much because, and I'll just give you a quick example with Cars Direct. Back in 98, 99, when we were doing Cars Direct, if 5% of consumers are going online, almost all of those 5% were in-market shoppers. If you were going online in 98, 99 to get automotive information, the likelihood that you were gonna buy the car was really high. So now today, given that we are selling as an absolute number fewer cars than we were in 1999, and yet everybody's online, being online is no longer an indicator at all of in-marketness. So, a big part of our business is trying to understand who's likely to buy a car and why and when and how and what, and so we're looking for people who are applying for credit, because if you apply for a car loan before you shop for a car, you're very committed to the transaction. We love people who have totaled their car, who are given an insurance check and a rental car. If you're driving around in a rental car with a $20,000 check, trust me, you're in market. We love the relevance of brands like AAA or USAA or Consumer Reports to the automotive transaction. So we run the auto buying programs today for a lot of those organizations, 1,500 of them, in fact, around the country. And so where we find relevance, we go in and exploit that. And I think that, the issue for us at this point is really execution. I think that there's a whole bunch of dynamics that change as we become a public company and whether or not I am the right guy to run it. But this has been the most interesting year of my career as an entrepreneur, and it was definitely when everything went to shit. I mean, all of those parts of my life were on a level 0 at the same time. And I can literally say, 6 months after that bottom, all of those are on sort of a level 8 or a 9 right now, which is great. Right?
What I'm just came to my head about car sharing services like Zipcar or a lot of the initiatives from the dealerships to try to get electric cars in, not just necessarily owned, but just in the hands of people in terms of like day trips or very, very like minimal usage, but the shift in perception away from ownership to more like sharing.
So I think that, everybody's entitled to their opinion about this. So I think there's a lot of ways to make money in automotive, and I think that you can definitely have a successful business that's really novel and does something totally different than what everybody does today. I think that if I think about my personal habits, I don't want somebody else in my car when I'm not. I keep creepy things in my car. It's my car. That's like my personal safe, right? I can lock it even at home. I think your car is a personal thing, and if you have a nice car or you have a car that you love, you definitely don't want your wife driving or anybody driving the car. I just don't want them driving the car. So I think there's a sense of identity that comes from cars that people underestimate who sort of go into some of those things. I don't think those become major market trends. I think that there is, and this is sort of a geeky rabbit hole, but I think loans are interesting. I think leases are more interesting because you are only paying for the depreciation on the car. And so effectively you can get a 40% lower monthly payment if you lease the car. The problem is you don't own the vehicle at the end, and there's maybe some advantages and disadvantages to that. I think there is a third financial product. We bought a company at the end of 2011, and this is also where a lot of the fear factor came, called Automotive Lease Guide. 45-year-old company, controls 90% plus of the lease residual value prediction market. So lessors, banks, contact ALG and say, what will this car be worth in 3, 4, 5 years? And then they set up leasing programs. Leasing is traditionally a closed-end financial product. And what they're doing is they're asking ALG to predict what that value will be at 3, 4, 5 years. And depending on whether you take a 3, 4, 5 year lease, they just depreciate that amount. And they're taking a risk, right? they're taking a risk that at the end of that term, whatever it is, that the car will be worth more than what ALG said. Now, ALG wouldn't be a 45-year-old company if it was in the business of missing that very often, right? If lessors were losing that bet every year, they'd be like, why are we using ALG's number? So you got to think about, how does a bank get rid of a car, right? A bank gets rid of a car at the end of a lease by taking it to auction. That's how they get rid of it. So, well, the auction's digitized. So what ALG really does is they have a very complex set of algorithms and inputs about the economy and whatnot, but they always use the sanity check of understanding what is the auction value of this car likely to be based on historically what has the auction value been for a similar car, right? Well, the auction value is the wholesale market. There are 4 markets for a used car. The listing market, if you have a car that you want to sell, the first thing you do is you go to AutoTrader or Cars.com, you see what everybody else who's got that car is trying to get for theirs, right? And then you go, well, mine's better than theirs, so you know, I've got the 2006 Chevy Tahoe LTZ, everybody wants 21.5, I think mine's worth 22, I'll list it for 23, see what happens, give it a little time, right? In reality, when you study the transaction data, turns out those cars all sell for somewhere around 19, right? So you were already smoking crack. Your car's really worth 19, you think it's worth 23, fine, you got a $4,000 misperception. But then you go to your local dealer, the dealer, when they take the car, all they want to do is sell you the next car, right? So they're thinking, I've got to take this car and I've either got to recondition it and clean it up and put it out on the front line, so I'm going to put $2,000 into it, or I'm going to take it to auction myself, which is a headache, and somebody's got to pay me to do that. So the trade-in market at the dealership level is the worst market of all. They're like, I'll give you 10 for your car, and you're like, oh fuck, I think it's worth 23. So you're now $13,000 upside down on your car, but in reality, the dealer knows if he sends it to auction, he'll get 14, right? So the genuine gap between you and what you could get if you were a really good private party seller, which only happens 30% of the time, versus what you could get if you really had an honest conversation with the dealer, is now all of a sudden closer to $3,000 or $4,000, $5,000, right? It's not $13,000. And the $13,000 gap, the perception of that is the fear that makes you go and list your car at Kelley Blue Book or AutoTrader or any of these other sites. And that's why you pay the money, and that whole system works based on your fear of not taking that loss. When in reality, if we were just talking about understanding what is the real number, that market would be much more rational. Most people wouldn't go and try to sell it themselves. They would actually just say, you know what, I can just trust the dealer. 14 is actually pretty fair, right? I mean, I don't want to go through the headache. I don't want creepy people coming to my house. A whole bunch of reasons why that should work. ALG doesn't miss that number very often, but it's interesting, ALG's never been in the business of publishing that number on a daily basis. And so when we bought the company, the first thing we said is, does the algorithm actually derive a daily number for depreciation even though it's not linear? They said, well, sure, but nobody wants to see that number. Why would they? Because the car is structured around a 36, 48, or 60-month lease term. So we said, well, I want to know, so can you show me that? And it turns out you can buy downside residual gap insurance. There's companies that are in the insurance business that will say, if that car were to go to auction at any time along that timeline, would we cover the downside risk to a capped amount, right? Sure, so you can buy that. That might take the benefit that you get of a 40% reduction in the lease and add another $20 a month to the top. So maybe it's a 35% reduction in the cost on a monthly payment basis, but you've covered the customer to the downside risk. You've taken all the risk away from the lessor, and you've shifted it to the lessee, and you've given them insurance for that. Now you're lending money not on the asset or the depreciation of the asset, you're lending money entirely on the FICO score and the risk value of the customer. So the idea that you want to buy a $30,000 car structured as an open-end lease, not a closed-end lease, with a balloon payment for an early exit package with the residual insurance, means that if you buy the car from us, we'll buy it back from you anytime during the time you own it for a predetermined number, and we'll tell you what it is every single day. And all you have to do when you want to get out of that car is drive it to any one of our 6,000 dealers and just drop it off, and he'll print you a check off the printer. Holy shit. If you had that kind of flexibility on any car you bought that we'll buy it back every day for this number, you have at least a straw man for saying, wow, 14, pretty good. I'm going to go for the 19. Because, right? Because we're going to educate you at the same time. We're going to say, by the way, you're smoking crack if you think you're going to get 23. Here's the data to prove it. The real value of the car is 14. The listing market is plus $7,000. The transactional market on the private party side is plus $4,000. The trade-in market is minus $1,400 or minus $4,000 based on all the data. And again, Data and transparency make everybody a believer in that, right? And so I believe that there is a way to get people to pay much less than they're currently paying for a finance and not have to change their concept of owning their car. They own their car, they drive their car. The car is a thing, you're not gonna die with it. You might, but you're not gonna get to take it with you. So it really comes down to what are you paying to drive the car while you're driving.
I just want to be respectful of your time because it's past 7:30, okay?
All my kids are asleep by
Maybe
now.
one more question? and we'll-
Yeah.
I want to kind of come back to the beginning of TrueCar, and you were saying that first of all, you were introducing completely new method to the car dealers
Yeah.
by introducing paper sale, and secondary, you were also asking them for data back.
Yeah.
So it was a lot to deal with probably for them. So how operationally or business development wise, how did you personally deal with that strategically in terms of bringing those 5,000 dealers to you?
Well, I already had a reputation in the car business, right?
I know.
With Cars Direct, and so I think that was certainly an advantage, like, oh, he's back, right? And that helped. We also raised a lot of money. I mean, we came out of the gate and we had raised, $40 million, and we started building it, and the first year and a half was this guy building the systems that make cars configurable so that you can have an experience to configure a car, see a price and all of that. And so we had to have the systems built. Once that was built, there's a new phase that the business went through, which is, okay, we need to make sure that we have enough dealers. So we need to ramp up the sales side of the organization. And so that took a year. The business wasn't really a business until 2.5, 3 years in.
Okay.
And it's a big bet, right? I mean, we were going out and raising money on we're not gonna bootstrap this. We're gonna go out and win, give us a lot of money, because we know what we're doing, because that's the only way to play in this market.
What,
Okay, so
Well,
this
this
one,
one
that
asked-
one, and we're done.
because it started with passion for the automotive industry.
Yeah.
What is the access point for you? Because clearly you love the science of data,
Yeah.
but was it, you're just a car enthusiast, you're a racing enthusiast? What's the access point and passion point?
Well, I think so my first company was called Scott's Auto Detailing. It was a car detailing service, and it was sort of a way to get to drive cool cars. I was 14, and I had employed all the kids in the neighborhood. They would detail the cars, but I would drive them from somebody's house over to my house. And it was in rural Sacramento, so I got to usually drive the car for a mile or two. But I was getting these cool cars, and all the money went back to the people working on the detailing, and it was just a way for me to get to drive cars. I'm definitely a car guy. I definitely love cars, and I think anybody who has been a detractor of mine who's gotten to know me, they resonate on that, right? So Keith Crane and I ultimately broke bread over the whole, what's your favorite car? What was your first car? What do you got in your garage now? And I mean, that's where we really made a bond. So yeah, I'm a car guy. I'm definitely an entrepreneur that believes in the value of solving a problem as a way of getting to the big win. And I'm less interested in, and not everybody should take this approach, I'm less interested in how can I just make money. I think there's so many ways to make money. And in the car space in particular, everybody has taken that low-hanging fruit approach. It's such a big space, it's so dysfunctional, we can go in and just soak up this money. And you know what, they are, and they suck. But they're taking a lot of profit out, and they're successful, but they're really not solving the problem. And so I do think that there's a higher order sort of mission in business building. And all of my companies, I believe, solve big, gnarly problems. And I think one of our biggest defenses is complexity, believe it or not. So I believe in transparency, I believe in big data, but I believe in intellectual complexity. And the one great thing about having been a young entrepreneur in a market where you've got old car guys who do not want to hear from the young guys is to be clearly doing something they know nothing about in a way that you can bark at anybody from any position. I mean, I've been up with CEOs of car companies who are widely regarded as the biggest car guys in the business, and they do not know more than me about this. And so I just need to stick to the things I know, and then I can defend it. But I love the intellectual complexity of what we do.
One last one.
So that's my question towards the complexity. I was thinking about this question of the car share. And
Yeah.
so it seems what you're saying, eventually with this LIBOR-like figure you'll be able to publish every day, you're
Yeah.
going to dramatically reduce the number of cars manufactured each year because you're going to increase the rate at which the buy happens.
Yeah, I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think you certainly increase the velocity of the market, which grows it for everybody, but I believe we're heading towards a 20 million car market. So right now we're at a 15 million car market. We had been at a 16 million car market in the US, and then we went down to 9 million sort of in 2010. And so you've got, I think, a big rebound story. You've now got so much pent-up demand. I mean, the car business is booming right now because people just are driving cars that are much older than they were fleet-wise historically. I think that there's actually a really interesting crossover point, which is buying a new car in many points of view is a better financial alternative than buying a used car. And that's never been the case before. It used to always be if you want to save money, you should buy a used car because you don't take that big depreciation hit up front. That's actually not true if you go to that LIBOR-based sort of approach and you actually look at having a fungible choice and saying, once you're in the equity, you now are free to choose whatever you want. And there is a point, there's a crossover point in that depreciation curve where you flip. And I remember, for me, I know a lot about this stuff, and we own companies that do this, and so, I mean, I'm deep into it. The thing that taught me this lesson was I bought an Acura Legend, a 4-door Acura Legend, when I was like 23 years old. And I refinanced that car 7 or 8 times to start companies, actually. Because I was in the money every time. Like I bought the car and then I paid it down and I was like, holy shit, the car's still worth more. I can refi the car, and I just kept pulling $5,000–10,000 out of the car every couple of years, or not every couple of years, every couple of months. I mean, it was just crazy how that car held its value, and it was great. It was a great way to finance a bunch of stuff.
Thank you, Scott.